Hello, I'm Dr. David Gehring, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Nottingham in the Department of History. This is a little bit of a mini lecture for the Explore Your Archive event put on by Inspire here in our fair city of Nottingham. And I want to try to connect the story of the Mayflower and some of the people from Nottingham who were on that ship. I want to connect that story to a wider story, a longer story about religious migration and exile. And that's a story that stretches across both time and space. And I think that by connecting these people who were from Nottinghamshire, who traveled the ocean seas, by connecting their story to a broader chronology of exile and migration, we can see how, in many respects, those on the Mayflower were continuing a tradition long in the making, but then also adding a little bit of a twist with a little bit of a difference there towards the end. Now, William Bradford writes in his Journal of Plymouth Plantation, and in that journal we have the history, right? A really good history of the experience from the early 17th century, and we can see how, according to Bradford, a life of persecution and exile was in many respects almost expected for those who considered them the godly, right? And we can see in Bradford's story that story of migration or exile, first to Leiden in the Low Countries, and then across the Atlantic to the New World. And for people like Bradford, the Atlantic Ocean was for him what the Red Sea had been for the Israelites when fleeing from Egypt, right? And so we might consider, as Bradford and others did, that this was something of a new exodus to go over to the New World. But that new exodus had very much historical and biblical roots, right? Very much biblical roots. As Bradford put it himself in that journal, it was a mixed multitude that came into the wilderness with the people of God out of Egypt, right? He was, of course, quoting Exodus from the Old Testament, but he was talking about Plymouth Plantation. He was talking about the New World. Now, at its core, right, voluntary migration or forced exile are parts of that Judeo-Christian tradition. And at its core, these decisions, voluntary migration or forced exile, at its core, there is a tension between the inner belief or inner spirituality of a person with an outer institutional church or political body, right? So it's that tension between the internal and the external that we really need to understand when thinking about migration or exile. Because it was that formal or official, that institutional body that might compel an individual to conform to that orthodoxy or that authority. So there's a sense of compulsion from the institutional authorities. And so separatists, people who were looking to separate themselves from that institution, or would-be separatists, they essentially had a choice, okay? One, they could go underground, right? Try to keep their heads low, their noses clean, create something of a community, an underground community, but there would always be fear of persecution, fear of being caught, right? Smell down. Another option would be to resist, right? To fight against the authorities, right? And one could be fighting in church courts or in secular courts, or could be fighting with the local minister within the parish, right? On theological points, right? So there could be resistance. The third option was flight, right? The idea of religious flight was in many respects, for centuries really, justified on the grounds that by fleeing, the persecuted, the godly, could live to fight another day. Right? And so the three options there, essentially go underground, fight, or flight, were really in the minds of people like Bradford and the Separatists from right here in Nottinghamshire. And their ultimate goal, right, was an ideal of liberty of conscience, an ideal of Christian harmony, a community living, working, loving one another, in something of a recreated Eden, right? And so here it's very much an ideal. But time and time again, across time and space for the past many centuries, this ideal is very, very difficult to achieve in practice. This Eden proved very, very difficult to find, as Bradford himself noted, right? When he mentioned that it was a mixed multitude that came into the wilderness, right? He was talking about how it wasn't just always the godly, but rather other people came along as well. And so we have this tension and this decision at the core of the move to flee, right? First to Leiden and then to the New World. And so these pilgrims, these Puritans of the 1620 and of the subsequent Puritan migration, they were continuing this tradition deep within Christianity, going back to the Israelites, going back to Moses, going back to the Pentateuch and the Exodus, right? But it wasn't just biblical. It wasn't just Moses, right? That religious and political persecution of minorities might have been as old as the hills, right? And it might have been justified, actually, in some ways, by the great Christian father, Bishop of Hippo, Augustine, who argued that religious minorities should be compelled to come into the church, right? We should compel them. But it wasn't just biblical. It wasn't just within the fathers. In fact, there was a long history in the Middle Ages, particularly the high and later Middle Ages, of religious groups being persecuted, being chased up into the mountains. And we can think here of the Cathars and the Waldensians, right? These were groups started in the 12th century, moving into the 14th century for the Cathars, and for the Waldensians, even into the 16th century. These were groups in southern France and northern Italy, who really, in some respects, could be almost identified as early reformers or proto-Protestants. There were some ideas within these groups that were later identified and picked up by reformers of the 16th century, particularly among the Waldensians, no doubt about it. Also, here in this country, in England, in the 15th century and the late 14th century, we have a group known as the Lollards. Lollards, who were the the followers of John Wycliffe, a professor at Oxford. A lot of these folks were definitely identified as proto-Protestants, particularly in England by English Protestants of the 16th century, due to their focus on a vernacular Bible and a rejection of the Catholic Church. But these folks, again, they either needed to go underground, fight, or flee. And in a lot of times, the Lollards in particular decided to go underground. Right? They would try to have their own communities, clandestine book trades, stuff like that. And actually, the city you might see behind me is the city of Coventry. Right? This is a section of old medieval Coventry where the Lollards were often found in the 15th century. Also, related to the Lollards were the Hussites, followers of Jan Hus, in the area we now recognize as the Czech Republic. And here, this group was also a persecuted minority, and also definitely one picked up by later Lutherans in the 16th century in the Holy Roman Empire, modern Germany. Right? So we have a number of different groups, whether we're thinking about Waldensians, Lollards, Hussites, that were kind of early or proto-reformers, proto-Protestants, if you like. And the English Protestants of the 16th and 17th centuries would have been fully aware of these groups who had been persecuted, chased, and sometimes actually migrating from one area to another to avoid that persecution. But English Puritans of the 17th century would have been even more familiar with the more recent past, that of the Reformations of the 16th century. Right? And here, it's during the period of the 16th century that we see religious migration and exile really shift into high gear, if you like. Right? This is a period when we have Protestants of many different nationalities crossing political boundaries, going from one region to another within maybe one country, all with a view to finding safe haven, all with a view to fleeing authorities they felt were ungodly or unchristian, and trying to find a new home. Right? And that new home might be temporary until they might be able to move back to their own homelands, or it might be more long-lasting, right? More enduring. And here we can actually think of the most immediate history, the most relevant history to the English of the 16th and early 17th centuries. And here we can actually recall that in the 1540s, in particular in the mid and late 1540s, a lot of Protestants came to this country, came to England, fearing for their lives, fearing for their souls. Right? They sought in England a safe haven, particularly under King Edward VI and his Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer. And it's during that period, actually, that we find in London, but elsewhere as well, Coventry, right here, Coventry as well, we find communities, somewhat sizable communities of immigrants, of religious refugees coming to England and settling. Right? We see the establishment of what are called the stranger churches. The stranger churches were predominantly French and Italian, but other international communities as well. And the first superintendent of these stranger churches in London, 1554, was a Polish man by the name of Jan Olasko, and they were centered at Austin Friars, a former Augustinian monastery. And so they were right at the heart of the city of London, but they were also in other communities as well. Norwich, the second largest city in the whole of England during that time, had a large Dutch community, as a for example. Right? So we have a large amount of religious refugees fleeing from mainland Europe coming to London during the reign of Edward VI. But soon the tables turned fairly significantly, such that with the coming of Queen Mary, right, and the return to Catholicism within this country, we see those international refugees who had fled, come to this country, left. And they needed to leave very, very quickly. In fact, it was official, right? Mary was kicking them out. But then also a lot of English men, women, and children left with those refugees. They fled from England in the 1550s, right? And so we can see English men, women, and children going to Protestant safe havens in Denmark, in German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, and in Swiss lands. We can see particularly large English communities in places like Frankfurt, in Zurich, in Geneva, and later we even see some in Heidelberg, in the Palatinate. And so we can see that the exiles under Queen Mary, sometimes just called the Marian Exiles, were in many respects doing what their like-minded, maybe confessional brethren, if you like, had done in coming to England in the years previous. Now all of a sudden the tables have turned, the coin is flipped. We can see moving into the reign of Elizabeth, the coin goes back to the other side, if you like, and Elizabethan England becomes a safe haven, a magnet, if you like, once again for the international Protestant community. We see the French and the Dutch churches reestablished. We see these communities thriving, in fact, and contributing to London society, London industry, the commerce of the nation, if you like. We can see this particularly in the context of the French Wars of Religion and the Dutch Revolt. The Dutch revolt for a number of different reasons, both religious and political, from their Spanish overlords during the 1560s, and this war carries on all the way into the mid-17th century. But we can also see particularly bloody conflicts in the French Wars of Religion, which kick off in the early 1560s, really reach a particularly nasty point during the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in Paris, but elsewhere as well throughout France. About 12 provincial cities actually are affected. And so we can see then that this exile, this migration within mainland Europe, but then also extending to England as well during the 16th century, is very much a product of Reformation politics and disagreements, theological disagreements within maybe the French Protestant community, within the Dutch Protestant community, and within the English Protestant community as well during the reign of Mary. Right? So when we're thinking about the Separatists of Nottinghamshire, when we're thinking about William Bradford, when we're thinking about the Mayflower in 1620, 400 years ago, when we're thinking about the subsequent Puritan migration of the 1630s and beyond, we can see that these separatists, these migrants, these exiles, were continuing a tradition, we might say, as far back as Moses and the Exodus. But it was different this time, I think. And the Pilgrims of 1620, the Separatists of Nottinghamshire, had a different experience. And I think the difference lies in the distance traveled, but also in the endurance of that community. That community who, to this day, in fact, might call the New World home. And with that, I'll leave you. I hope you've enjoyed this little tour connecting Nottinghamshire and the Separatists over to the New World in both time and space. Again, I'm Dr. David Gehring. I'm a lecturer in early modern history at the University of Nottingham in the Department of History. Take care, everybody.